In the winter of 1947, the United States didn't face an invasion. It didn't face a storm powerful enough to tear cities apart. It faced something far quieter. Homes grew colder each night. Coal didn't arrive, lights dimmed, factories slowed, and millions of Americans slowly realized that the heat they depended on was no longer guaranteed. There were no sirens, no single moment of collapse, just ordinary life shrinking room by room, day by day. This was the year America ran out of heat. And before we go any further, pause for a moment, because this question matters more than the history. If your heat stopped working tonight, how long do you think your home would really stay livable? A day, 2, a week? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and how long you think you'd last without heat. Because in 1947, millions of people had to find out the answer the hard way. By the winter of 1947, the United States believed it had entered a safer chapter of history. World War II had ended 2 years earlier, in September 1945. More than 16 million Americans had served in uniform. Entire cities had been converted to wartime production. Rationing had shaped daily life for years. And now, at last, the country was trying to breathe again. Soldiers were home. Factories had shifted back to civilian goods. New houses were going up at a pace America had never seen before. Between 1946 and 1947, over 1 million new homes were built, many for young families starting over after the war. The future, people believed, was finally warming up. Winter, by comparison, felt manageable. Americans had lived through cold seasons before, even harsh ones. They had endured blackouts during the war, ration cards, shortages, uncertainty. Compared to that, a normal winter seemed almost reassuring. Furnaces were installed, coal bins were filled, railroads ran on tight schedules. The system had worked through a global war. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't work now. But as December 1947 settled in, something felt wrong. Temperatures dropped early and stayed low. In cities across the Northeast and Midwest, average daily temperatures fell 10 to 15 degrees below normal and refused to rise. Snow accumulated not in dramatic storms, but in steady layers that never fully melted. Inside homes, furnaces ran longer than expected. Coal burned faster than planned. Families adjusted quietly, closing off spare rooms, adding blankets, keeping coats nearby. But no one panicked. Winter was winter. Supplies would arrive. Coal deliveries didn't. Coal was the backbone of American life in 1947, even if most people never thought about it. Nearly 70% of U.S. homes relied on coal for heating. Coal generated the majority of the nation's electricity. It powered trains, factories, steel mills, and glass plants. In a single year, the United States consumed more than 600 million tons of coal, moving it across the country by rail in an intricate, tightly balanced system. As long as coal moved, America moved. That winter, it slowed. Rail congestion increased. Labor shortages in the mines lingered from the war years. Demand surged as coal tightened its grip, but supply failed to keep pace. By January 1948, coal stockpiles at power plants and rail yards had dropped to dangerously low levels. Some cities reported reserves measured not in weeks, but in days. At first, the effects were subtle. Delivery trucks arrived late, then partially filled, then not at all. People called suppliers and received the same answers everywhere: delays, backlogs, uncertainty. Coal dealers rationed what they had. Households burned through reserves faster than planned, still assuming the system would correct itself. It always had before. Factories noticed next. Power interruptions became more frequent. Production schedules were cut, shifts shortened. In some industrial regions, output dropped by 20 to 30%, as electricity was diverted away from manufacturing to preserve residential heating. Office buildings dimmed lights. Elevators were shut down to conserve power. In cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, streetlights were reduced or turned off entirely, not because of damage, but by order. Inside homes, the change became impossible to ignore. Radiators stayed warm, but never hot. Living rooms cooled by evening. Kitchens were used quickly, then abandoned. Families gathered in one room because heating the entire house was no longer realistic. Children did homework wrapped in sweaters and coats. At night, people listened to furnaces cycle on and off, counting the minutes between runs, hoping the system would hold until morning. This wasn't fear yet. It was disbelief. The war had ended. America had won. The country that had supplied 2 oceans of fighting, that had produced 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, and millions of tons of material for victory, was not supposed to be struggling to stay warm. Heat was not a luxury, it was a certainty, or so everyone thought. But winter after winter of hardship was supposed to be over. And yet, in 1947, as temperatures stayed low and coal failed to arrive, a quiet realization began to spread from house to house, city to city. This time, the problem wasn't the weather, it was the system. And for the first time since the war ended, Americans began to wonder whether the modern life they depended on could still be trusted to show up when they needed it most. To understand why the winter of 1947-1948 felt so unsettling so quickly, you have to understand just how completely the United States depended on coal at that moment in history. Coal was not one part of the system, it was the system. In 1947, the United States produced roughly 630 million tons of coal, and nearly every major function of daily life depended on it moving on time, every day, without interruption. More than 70% of American households relied on coal-fired furnaces for heat. Around 90% of electricity in some industrial regions came from coal-burning power plants. Railroads, the arteries of the nation, ran on coal. Steel mills, glass factories, paper plants, chemical works, and shipyards all required a constant, uninterrupted supply. Coal was heat, light, movement, and production rolled into one, and because it had always been there, few people understood how fragile that dependence really was. The system only worked under one condition: balance. Mines had to extract coal at a steady pace. Railroads had to move it efficiently. Power plants had to burn it as fast as it arrived. Stockpiles were intentionally kept small to reduce costs and keep fuel fresh. In normal winters, that balance held. In a harsh winter, it tightened. In the winter of 1947, it snapped. Cold weather drove demand sharply upward just as supply faltered. Mine output lagged behind schedule due to lingering labor shortages, worn-out equipment from the war years, and transportation bottlenecks that had never been fully resolved after wartime strain. Rail congestion worsened as snow and ice slowed trains, reduced switching efficiency, and froze equipment in place. A system designed for precision suddenly had no margin at all. By January 1948, the numbers were alarming. Coal reserves at power plants in major cities dropped to less than 10 days' supply, and in some cases to less than 5 days. Rail yards reported shortages so severe that trains were rerouted repeatedly, robbing one region to supply another. Utilities faced impossible decisions: continue powering factories that supported jobs and economic recovery, or divert fuel to keep homes warm. Increasingly, they chose homes, but even that choice came at a cost. Electricity generation was reduced, voltage was lowered, blackouts became a real possibility, not because of storms or sabotage, but because there simply wasn't enough fuel to keep the turbines spinning. What made the situation more disturbing was how invisible it was to most people. There was no single moment when the system failed. No announcement that America had entered a crisis. The coal shortage revealed itself through absence, a delivery that didn't arrive, a furnace that ran longer but produced less heat, a factory shift quietly cancelled, a train that never pulled into the station. Each delay on its own seemed manageable. Together, they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore with every passing week. Cities began to react. In New York, authorities ordered office buildings to reduce heating and lighting. In Chicago, factories were asked to suspend operations several days a week to conserve fuel. Across the Midwest and Northeast, utilities implemented rolling reductions, dimming streetlights, and limiting electricity to non-essential services. Schools closed not because of snowstorms, but because classrooms could not be kept above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Hospitals rationed heat room by room. Even government buildings shortened hours to save fuel. For ordinary Americans, the realization came slowly but unmistakably. This was not just a cold winter. This was an energy shortage unfolding in real time. The same nation that had powered an industrial war effort of unprecedented scale was now struggling to keep furnaces lit and lights on. And as coal continued to fall behind demand, the question shifted from inconvenience to something far more troubling. If coal was the backbone of American life, what happened when the backbone began to fail? By February 1948, the shortage was no longer something Americans felt only inside their homes. It had begun to reshape public life in ways that were impossible to ignore. Across the country, cities took steps that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier, not during wartime, but during peace. Streetlights were dimmed or shut off entirely in major urban centers, including New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, and Detroit, plunging familiar neighborhoods into early darkness. Office buildings were ordered to reduce heating and lighting, with some floors closed altogether to conserve fuel. In many cities, elevators stopped running above certain levels, forcing workers to climb stairwells in coats and gloves. Schools closed by the thousands, not because of blizzards, but because classrooms could not be kept warm enough for children to sit still for hours. In some districts, indoor temperatures fell below 50 degrees Celsius, and administrators were given a choice: close the schools or risk widespread illness. Factories, already struggling with uneven power supply, began shutting down on designated coal holidays, losing entire workdays to conservation orders. In the industrial Midwest alone, production dropped by an estimated 20 to 30%, threatening jobs at a time when post-war stability still felt fragile. Inside American homes, the psychological shift was just as stark. Families adapted quickly, but not comfortably. Living rooms became sleeping rooms. Coats were worn indoors as a matter of routine. Children were sent to bed early to conserve heat, wrapped in multiple blankets, sometimes with hats still on. Furnaces were run in short bursts instead of continuously, a practice that kept pipes from freezing but never allowed houses to truly warm. In coal-heated homes, families measured fuel in days, not weeks, counting shovelfuls and watching bins empty with a growing sense of dread. Elderly Americans were hit hardest. Hospitals reported spikes in cold-related illnesses, respiratory infections, and complications made worse by prolonged exposure to low indoor temperatures. Doctors warned that hypothermia did not require blizzards or outdoor exposure. It could happen quietly, indoors, when heat was insufficient for too long. What made this moment so unsettling was its ordinariness. There were no sirens, no rubble in the streets, no enemy to point to. Life didn't collapse, it narrowed, everything slowed, dimmed, and cooled. Americans lined up for fuel the way they once had for rationed goods during the war, but without the emotional clarity of sacrifice for a cause. This time, there was no victory promised at the end, just endurance. By late February, federal officials acknowledged that coal consumption was outpacing supply by millions of tons, and reserves in some regions were hovering at less than 1 week's worth of fuel. The country was not freezing all at once, but it was cooling steadily day after day, room by room, until the question was no longer whether life would return to normal, but how much more strain the system, and the people living inside it, could absorb before something gave way. By the time February 1948 reached its midpoint, the scale of the crisis could no longer be managed quietly. Coal stockpiles had fallen so low that in some regions power plants were operating with less than 5 days of fuel on hand. Rail congestion had become a national bottleneck. Mines could not increase output fast enough, and even when coal was available, it often couldn't be moved where it was needed. For the first time since the war ended, federal officials were forced to admit something most Americans had never considered. The country did not have enough energy to function normally. What happened next stunned people. In late February 1948, the federal government stepped in and issued emergency orders that reached into everyday life in ways usually reserved for wartime. The goal was simple but alarming: reduce coal consumption immediately or risk total system failure. Across the country, non-essential businesses were ordered to close for multiple days each week. Office buildings were instructed to shut down early or stop operating entirely. In some cities, work weeks were cut to 3 or 4 days, not because of economic recession, but because there wasn't enough fuel to keep buildings warm and machines running. Factories that had only recently returned to civilian production after World War II were told to power down again. Steel mills slowed. Paper plants shut temporarily. Manufacturing output dropped further, threatening tens of thousands of jobs at a moment when Americans believed prosperity was finally within reach. Even government buildings were not exempt. Federal offices reduced hours, lights were dimmed, heat was lowered. Washington itself went cold. Perhaps most unsettling of all, cities were ordered to intentionally darken themselves. Streetlights were switched off or reduced across large sections of major metropolitan areas. Public buildings operated under strict lighting limits. Advertisements went dark. The glow that defined American cities at night faded, not because of air raids or blackouts, but because energy had become too precious to waste. For a generation that had lived through wartime blackout drills, the symbolism was unmistakable, except this time, there was no enemy, no sirens, no end date. The government urged citizens to conserve fuel in their own homes. Newspapers printed instructions on how to burn coal more efficiently, how to seal windows, how to heat only one room. Radio announcements asked Americans to endure the cold for the good of the nation. The language was familiar, echoing wartime appeals, but the context was deeply unsettling. The war was over. The country had won. And yet people were being asked once again to sacrifice, not for victory, but to keep the system from collapsing. What made these measures so frightening wasn't their severity, but their purpose. These were not temporary inconveniences meant to get through a storm. They were emergency controls designed to slow the entire nation down. The United States was deliberately reducing its own activity, dimming its lights, shortening its days, because it could not produce or move enough heat to sustain normal life. For many Americans, this was the moment the reality set in. The problem wasn't weather, it wasn't mismanagement in one city or one industry. It was national. The same country that had mobilized unmatched industrial power during World War II was now rationing warmth in peacetime. And as factories went quiet and cities grew darker, an uncomfortable question settled in across the country. If heat could disappear this quickly, what else could vanish with it? While federal orders reshaped cities and factories, the real weight of the crisis settled quietly inside American homes, where there were no headlines, no announcements, and no clear sense of when relief might come. By late February, millions of families had adjusted their lives around a single calculation: how to stay warm enough to get through the night without running out of fuel entirely. In coal-heated houses, bins that were supposed to last the rest of winter were already dangerously low. Families rationed shovelfuls the way they once rationed sugar and meat during the war. spreading fires thin and letting rooms cool deliberately to conserve what little remained. Living rooms became the only occupied spaces in many homes, with doors to bedrooms and kitchens kept shut to trap heat. Children slept together under piles of blankets, sometimes still wearing coats or sweaters. Adults stayed awake longer than usual, listening for the furnace to kick on, waking in the early hours to stir fires that had burned down too quickly in the cold. For many, the cold was not dramatic. It was persistent and exhausting. Temperatures inside homes often hovered in the low 50s Fahrenheit, sometimes dropping into the 40s overnight. Breath was visible in hallways. Water froze in bathroom pipes. Windows glazed over from the inside. People learned to move carefully because a fall or illness could become dangerous when heat was unreliable. Doctors warned that prolonged exposure to cold indoors increased the risk of pneumonia and heart complications, especially among the elderly. Hospitals reported rising admissions tied not to accidents or epidemics, but to the quiet toll of living in inadequately heated spaces for weeks on end. Fuel shortages pushed families to difficult decisions. Furniture was broken apart and fed into stoves. Wooden crates, fence posts, and scrap lumber disappeared from yards. In some neighborhoods, residents scavenged anything combustible, knowing it might be the difference between warmth and freezing before morning. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder that survival depended on burning pieces of the life people had worked to build. Meals grew simpler and colder. Kitchens were used quickly, then abandoned. Families ate early and went to bed not out of habit, but to conserve heat. What made this period especially unsettling was the absence of chaos. There were no riots, no mass panic, no visible breakdown of order. People endured quietly, drawing on habits learned during wartime shortages, but without the shared clarity of purpose that war had provided. There was no enemy to blame, no victory to anticipate, only the steady grind of cold days and colder nights. Radios carried appeals for conservation, but offered no timelines, no reassurance. Each household faced the winter largely alone, hoping that deliveries would resume before reserves ran out completely. Across the country, the same scene repeated itself millions of times. Families sitting close together, lights dimmed, heat rationed, waiting for warmer weather, waiting for coal, waiting for the system to begin working again. And as the winter stretched on, it became clear that the greatest strain was not the cold itself, but the uncertainty. The slow realization that modern comfort could disappear without warning, and that even in peacetime America, staying warm was no longer something anyone could take for granted. When the crisis finally began to ease in March 1948, it did not end with a single announcement or a dramatic turning point. Temperatures rose slowly. Rail traffic improved unevenly. Coal deliveries resumed in fits and starts. Power plants rebuilt their stockpiles one train at a time. The country did not feel rescued. It simply felt less cold. And because there was no moment that clearly marked the end, the winter slipped quietly out of public focus. Factories restarted, offices reopened, streetlights came back on. Life accelerated again, eager to move forward. America, exhausted by years of sacrifice, did not want another hardship added to its memory. That is why this winter faded. There was no explosion to replay on the evening news, no single town wiped off the map, no photograph that could stand in for the whole event. The coal crisis of 1947-48 unfolded slowly, unevenly, and everywhere at once. It was experienced in living rooms, basements, classrooms, and hospital wards, places that rarely become symbols. The damage it caused was cumulative rather than spectacular. Lost wages, closed schools, worsened health, strain that did not leave ruins behind, only fatigue. History tends to remember moments of sudden destruction. It struggles with long periods of endurance. The timing mattered too. America was desperate for a new story. The war had ended in 1945, and the country was in the middle of redefining itself as a peacetime superpower. The narrative was progress, abundance, and growth. Admitting that millions of Americans had gone cold just 2 years after victory did not fit that image. So the crisis was framed as temporary, unavoidable, already solved. Newspapers moved on. Politicians shifted focus. The public followed willingly. Forgetting was easier than reckoning. Yet the people who lived through it did not forget. They remembered the nights spent listening to furnaces fail, the days when schools closed because classrooms were too cold for children to write, the quiet fear of watching fuel supplies dwindle with no clear answer about when more would arrive. They remembered learning firsthand that modern life depended on fragile systems operating perfectly, and that when those systems faltered, the consequences reached directly into the home. The winter of 1947-48 left no monuments and no anniversaries. It is rarely taught, rarely mentioned, but it left behind something more subtle and more enduring, a lesson buried beneath the optimism of the post-war boom, that prosperity does not eliminate vulnerability, that peace does not guarantee stability, and that a nation can come dangerously close to failure, not through chaos or conflict, but through the quiet absence of something as basic as heat. And the decision, collective and unspoken, to move on without ever fully confronting what that absence revealed. The winter of 1947-1948 did not end in celebration, but it did not pass without consequence. Quietly, almost without public discussion, it forced the United States to confront a reality it had never fully acknowledged. Energy was not just a commodity, it was infrastructure. And when that infrastructure failed, everything built on top of it became vulnerable. In the months that followed, federal agencies began treating fuel supply as a matter of national security rather than simple logistics. Coal stockpile requirements were increased at power plants and rail hubs. Coordination between mines, railroads, and utilities was tightened to prevent single points of failure. Emergency planning expanded beyond short-term disruptions to account for prolonged shortages. Not storms, not sabotage, but sustained imbalance between supply and demand. These changes were technical, largely invisible to the public, and intentionally quiet. The country did not want reminders of how close it had come to standing still. But the deeper change was cultural. Americans who lived through that winter carried the lesson with them, often without putting it into words. Extra fuel kept on hand, a tendency to heat fewer rooms, an instinct to conserve when temperatures dropped sharply. The understanding that comfort could not be assumed, even in a nation that had just proven its industrial strength to the world. These habits didn't come from policy or headlines. They came from nights spent in cold houses, from waiting for deliveries that didn't arrive, from learning that modern systems worked only as long as every link held. As the years passed, the crisis was buried beneath new narratives: suburban expansion, economic growth, the promise of endless progress. Central heating improved, energy sources diversified, forecasting became more accurate. For decades, it became easy to believe that the conditions of 1947 could not return. That heat, like electricity and water, was permanent. History suggests otherwise. The lesson of that winter is not about coal or even about cold. It is about dependence, about how quickly daily life can unravel when systems fail quietly rather than catastrophically. No alarms sound, no dramatic images appear. People simply begin adapting, shrinking their lives, enduring, hoping the system recovers before they run out of margin. The year America ran out of heat matters because it exposed a truth that remains uncomfortable even now. Resilience is not something revealed in moments of triumph. It is tested in long stretches of uncertainty when nothing spectacular happens, but everything essential becomes fragile. In 1948, spring eventually arrived. Trains ran again. Lights came back on, homes warmed, and America moved forward, eager to forget. But the systems that failed that winter never stopped being vulnerable. They only became easier to overlook. And history has a way of reminding us, often quietly, that what feels guaranteed today can disappear just as silently tomorrow. Today, it's difficult to imagine a country like the United States running out of heat. Thermostats respond instantly. Lights turn on without thought. Energy arrives silently, invisibly, woven so tightly into daily life that it barely registers as something that could ever fail. Cold, when it comes, feels temporary, an inconvenience measured in hours or days, not weeks or months. The systems behind that comfort feel distant, abstract, and dependable by default. That confidence is exactly what made the winter of 1947-1948 so unsettling. What that year revealed was not a flaw in technology, but a flaw in assumption. Americans believed that modern life had finally outrun vulnerability, that the sacrifices of war had purchased permanence, that infrastructure once built at scale would simply continue to function. But the coal crisis showed how quickly those beliefs could unravel when pressure lasted longer than expected. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough, for long enough, to force millions of people to adapt their lives around absence. There was no single moment when America failed. There was only a gradual narrowing of normal life. Rooms went unheated, streets went dark, work slowed, families adjusted. The country did not collapse. It endured. And that endurance, paradoxically, is why the lesson faded. Survival without spectacle rarely earns a place in memory. But the warning remains. Modern systems still rely on balance, on timing, on supply chains that assume everything upstream continues to work. When that balance is disrupted, by weather, labor, energy, or something no one expects, the effects move outward quickly and inward even faster, reaching straight into homes. The difference between stability and strain is often measured not in disaster, but in duration. The year America ran out of heat is not remembered because it does not fit the stories we prefer to tell about progress. It sits uncomfortably between triumph and failure, but that is precisely why it matters. It reminds us that resilience is not built in moments of victory, but tested during long, quiet stretches when help is delayed, answers are unclear, and people are left to adapt on their own. History does not always warn loudly. Sometimes it whispers. And in the winter of 1947-1948, the whisper was simple and easy to ignore. What feels permanent rarely is.